welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohen, and today I'm pleased to welcome back Dana Gioia for the second part of our two-part interview. Dana Gioia is chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts and a noted poet and literary and cultural critic in his own right. In the first part of our interview, we focused on our guest leadership of the NEA. In this second part, we'll talk about his own poetry and his view of the state of poetry and of literature in general. Dana Gioia, welcome back to the Drexel interview.
Good to be here.
Okay. You are a great proponent of memorizing and recitation of poetry aloud. And I wondered if you could begin our interview by reciting one of your own poems, since I know you are a poet as well as a critic.
Okay, well, let me recite a very short one.
Okay.
It's only 6 lines long.
Okay.
Although it began as a much longer poem, and I kept cutting it down and cutting it down and cutting it down. Actually, the Philadelphia Inquirer asked me for a poem about New Year's, Day, and I ended up, writing a poem. By the end of it, it had nothing to do with New Year's, so I had to write them another poem. And this is called Unsaid. And what it's really about is how much of the life that we lead is invisible to anybody but ourselves. Unsaid. So much of what we live goes on inside. The diaries of grief, the tongue-tied aches of unacknowledged love are no less real for having passed unsaid. What we conceal is always more than what we dare confide. Think of the letters that we write our dead.
It's beautiful and true.
Well, it's an odd and private poem in some ways, but I think it touches a chord in most people's lives. At least I hope it does.
Yeah, I think it's got a universal resonance. Now, it's interesting that you say it started out as a much longer poem, and then you condensed it.
Well, I started off as a 36-line poem about New Year's Day. And then after I wrote it, I began to cut it down to 32, to 28, to 24. A month later, it was at 20, to 16, to 12. And finally, when it was about 8 lines long, I realized it was far too long. And I cut it down to 6 lines. And then it was there, but it no longer had anything to do with New Year's.
So you wrote another poem for the choir.
And so what I discovered that about poems is that a poem has a kind of meaning it wants to have, and what the poet's job is to collaborate with language to let it take the course of imagination.
That's so true. I mean, as a fiction writer, I would say the same, that it takes on a life of its own, and you have to let it, you have to follow it.
Yes.
So I can see that would be true. I'm interested, though, in this whole process of condensation that happens. You often find that you pare down?
Yes, I do. I almost always cut my poems substantially. And I do it for 2 reasons. First of all, I'm an anthologist, and as I put together anthologies of great poems, the thing that is remarkable is how short most of them are.
Yeah.
And I realize that most contemporary poems are kind of long-winded, sort of sprawl a bit.
Yeah.
And secondly, I've discovered that a lot of times when you cut something out, you actually make the poem stronger.
Absolutely.
Because you make the reader have to lean a little bit more forward into it and to project their own life. In fact, I've come to think now that a great poem almost always leaves something essential out. And then the reader has to supply that from their own life experience. And part of that sort of projecting your own life into a poem is that particular excitement that we get from poetry.
Interesting. Now, that also sparks a thought in me. I know that you are very much a proponent of, I guess it's been called the new formalism, which is a return to form, which has been sort of maligned in recent years. That is to say, meter and even rhyme. And is there any connection there between what you just said about the way a poem draws you in and those aspects of
I think
poetry?
it's a big subject, but let me start off by saying that for me, poetry has primarily always been an auditory art. What a poet is a kind of enchantment. A poet creates a spell with the music of words, and that kind of hypnotic state that the music of poetry creates allows the reader to, first of all, bring down the defenses that we carry through every day of our lives that make ourselves more vulnerable. And so in a sense that enchantment heightens our attention and our retention of the message. And so it seems to me that that it's easier to do that, with rhythm and meter. And there's a lot of poems, I think, that sort of create that spell. Now, I also believe that we are living in a point in culture, and the very fact that we're having a literary show on television demonstrates my point, where our culture is an auditory culture again. People can read, but they get much of their information on the telephone, on TV, on radio, on iPods, et cetera, et cetera. And so that spoken language has a kind of dynamism and importance in our culture that it simply didn't have when T.S. Eliot was writing. In fact, I think our age is much closer to Shakespeare's age than it is to Eliot's age.
It's more performative.
Yeah, it's performative, it's verbal, vocal.
Well, you've written a book called Disappearing Ink and the Decline of Print Culture. Is that, I don't know if I got that quite right. But in it, you talk about the decline of print culture, and I assume in some part you bemoan that. But on the other hand, there are these tremendous movements that are going on in poetry in particular that are very performative. I'm thinking of rap and cowboy poetry and stand-up poetry and this sort of thing. What do you think of those movements?
Well, I mean, I would say that new formalism, which is in a sense literary poetry's equivalent of rap, of stand-up poetry, of hip-hop, in that it's a performative, vocal, auditory kind of poetry. And I mean, the interesting thing is that poetry is the best-selling category of recorded sound. We call it rap, but it outsells every other kind of recorded sound. People are hungry for poetry, and when the academic poets, the literary poets, aren't feeding that hunger, what you've seen in the last 25 years is that the people, as it were, invent new forms of poetry to feed that hunger. And so I think we have a generation of kids coming up right now because of their experience with rap, with poetry slams and things like this, have an extremely sophisticated and heightened sense of auditory language, words being shaped for literary effect in performance. And I think that's good news for poetry.
Do you see that circling back to the print culture, or do you see the print culture essentially dead? I know you can't see that because you're sponsoring so much at the NEA that has to do with
a way of thinking about it is that we're in a culture that's not about either or. It's not that print dies and spoken language rises. We're in a culture which is much more complicated. What we have, really for the first time in history, are 5 or 6 different kinds of technologies. Print is one, film is one, sound is one, that each of these, in a sense, does something slightly better than the other. Right now I'm reading War and Peace by Tolstoy. It's an incredible experience. You lose yourselves in the lives of these characters. That is a print experience. You cannot recreate that even with a TV mini-series because you get inside the minds of people, and nothing does that so well as the novel or the short story. On the other hand, the interesting thing about poetry was created by society before print ever existed. It is primarily a verbal vocal art. And so in this odd sense, poetry finds itself very much at home in a secondary audio culture. That it's oral. It's not the fact that people can't read, but that people like to communicate as much through oral language.
Right, but that's one strand of poetry. There's also the highly intellectual element in poetry that, of course, would not translate well to performative expression.
It can and it can't. I mean,
say T.S. Eliot, as you had mentioned before.
But T.S. Eliot works awfully well when you say him out loud.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, think of it this way. Shakespeare never chose to publish his plays. They work beautifully on the page and they work beautifully in performance. So I think that, a lot of poets like myself, we're writing both for the page, basically, and for performance. Not performance in terms of ranting and raving our brief hour upon the stage, but in terms of a kind of an oral reading of poetry. And so I think that in a funny way, poetry is returning back to its historical norm. We're writing a kind of poetry that Donne and Milton and Dante would have understood.
Okay, yeah, I agree. I want to talk a little bit about your own background, which fascinates me.
It's a very odd background.
It's odd, and I'm just going to outline it briefly, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about what motivated you to go from place to place. Now, you started out, you attended a Catholic boys' school in California, high school, where I read that you were something of a cut-up, but still managed to be the valedictorian. Okay, you may want to explain that, but we can move on. Then Stanford University, where your interest was music, and you wanted to be a composer. You became interested in German and German poetry, and when you graduated from Stanford, you decided to go to graduate school at Harvard for a degree in Comp Lit.
Yeah.
And then from there, you then decided, for reasons that you can explain to us, to give up that course and go back to Stanford for an MBA. Now, I find this fascinating. It's a very circuitous course. You then went into business. You worked for 15 years at General Foods, where you rose to the position of vice president. You continued to publish poetry in the New Yorker and other places. Then you became head of the NEA. I'm interested in whether this route was, whether you were confused and upset as you were moving through these various changes, or if there was a method to it, and I guess secondarily, since I have a son in college who hasn't got a clue what he wants to do, whether you see this as a healthy kind of oscillating back and forth.
Well, actually, you've simplified my career, because between my business career and my NEA career, I was also a freelance writer for 12 years.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So it's, I was a bohemian. I went from business to bohemia to bureaucracy.
So after General Foods, you were working.
Let me see if I can explain, put some method to my madness.
Okay.
I'm a working class Latin kid from LA. My dad's Italian, my mom's Mexican.
Okay.
I'm the first member of my family ever to go to college. And like a lot of people, I knew at a very early age I wanted to be an artist. But I had that kind of vague...
And how did you know that?
Because I would hear music and it would just ravish me, where everybody else sort of said, oh, that's nice. I'd read a book and it would just change my life, and everybody would say, oh, it's okay. And I mean, paintings, music, literature always just knocked me over, and I just wanted to have a life where I was near it. But I had no role models, growing up. I mean, nobody we knew. They were all craftsmen or carpenters or worked in plants. My dad was a chauffeur, then he was a cab driver, then he worked in a department store. My mom was an operator for Ma Bell. And so, the one art that I had early training in was music. And so I thought I wanted to be a musician and a composer, although I always liked poetry. And then when I went to Stanford, over the first couple of years of Stanford, I made the shift between music into poetry. And I knew by the time I was about 20 that I wanted to be a poet. But that raised a problem. How does a poet make a living? And my parents neglected to give me the private income I so richly deserved.
I see.
And so I figured I had to do it myself. So I figured, well, the only poets I've met are professors, so I'll go to graduate school. So I got a fellowship to Harvard, and I was in graduate school. I had wonderful teachers. I had Elizabeth Bishop, I had Northrop Frye, I had Robert Fitzgerald, the great translator of classics.
Now, were you studying literary theory and literature, or were you actually studying poetry?
Well, I was studying Comp Lit,
Yeah.
which at that point was beginning to be literary theory.
Yes, yes.
And after a couple of years, I liked it. I was very good at it, but I said, two things are happening. They're training me to write literature and write about literature in a way that the very people I came from can't understand. And secondly, I like this academic stuff, and I'm beginning to write stuff that's just too complicated, because I'm writing a poem to be interpreted rather than to register. And I figured I had to get out of academia, because it was, while I liked it, it wasn't good for me as a writer. So I quit, and I decided to go to business school. But I think I'm probably the only person in human history that went to Stanford Business School to be a poet.
Okay. And it did work out for you that way.
And I made myself a promise that I would write or read 3 hours every day. And so for the next 17 years, the 2 years in business school and the 15 years in business, I worked every day. And I began publishing, and I was really quite successful. And then I had a number of things happen in my life. The most significant one is my first son died in childhood. And I had a heightened sense of my own mortality, and I decided one day I was going to quit my job. So after 15 years at General Foods,